Everyone, in this video we're going to continue practicing our use of memory tables. So as you know, the first step is to write down the name of the method that we are examining. So let's take a look at our first method call, which as you can see is here within our main class, and that's our add nums method. We saw this in our last example. Except now we have a different argument. So let's go through it again, just so we know what this looks like. So write down the name of the method in question, and then we want to write down the name of the variables and parameters that we see within our method definition. So in this case, let's start with our parameter because it's the first name that we see. So final value. And we know that final value currently is 3, because that's the number that's passed into our method call. All right, and then we jump to the first line of code that we see within our method's body that isn't a comment. So that's here, and that means that we have a variable named numbers. So we write down that name as well. And more specifically, it's going to equal an empty array list. And remember, we want to keep track of our array lists and our arrays by using square brackets inside of the value column of the memory table. Then we jump down to our next line of code, which is another variable. So we write it down. In this case, it's count, and count is equal to 0. Now we hit our while loop, and we ask is count less than or equal to final value. It is, so we can execute the body of this while loop, and that's where we're going to add the current value of count to our array list. That means we're going to add 0 to numbers. Then we update the value of count to be its current value plus 1, and remember, when a value changes, I want you to cross it out. Right? That way we know it was already that value when it's changed. If we erase it, we can sometimes forget that it was previous values. So we jump back up to the top of the while loop, ask ourselves if the condition is true, 1 is less than 3, which means we can execute the body of our while loop again by adding count to the current array list numbers. So that's 1. And then updating the value of count 2, of course. We jump back up to the top, and we ask is count less than or equal to final value. Well, 2 is less than 3. That means we can execute the body, and we add the current value of count to numbers, and we update the value of count. We jump back up to the top of our while loop, and we ask is count less than or equal to final value. Well, they're equal this time, both are 3. That's still a true statement though, so we can execute the body and add count to our array list numbers. And then we update the value of count. In this case, count becomes 4. Now we jump back up to the top, and we ask is count less than or equal to final value? Well, 4 is greater than 3, so that means that we don't get to execute the body of our while loop. Instead, we're going to look for that final curly brace and then execute any line that we find after it. In this case, we're going to return numbers, so make sure you write that down. This can help us keep track of what this call statement becomes. It becomes the array the array list 0, 1, 2, and 3. Cool. And now that we're done with that, don't forget to cross it out. That way we know we finished this table. All right, but we're not done yet. Looks like we need to make another memory table. There's another function call here for a different function called sum numbers. So here's another memory table. Let's go through sum numbers. So step 1, write down the name of the method. In this case, sum numbers. We find the body and we look for parameters, if there are any. In this case, there's one. It's called array list. So we want to write that down in the name column. So what's the current value of array list? Well, that is passed into the function call numbers. What's numbers? Well, we saw that at the very beginning. It's an array list of these integers, 0, 1, 2, and 3. So we got to write that down. I'm going to make my square brackets a little bit wider so that I can have some more room just in case something changes. But this is currently what our parameter array list is. So now we jump into the body of our method and we look to see if there are any variables being created. In this case, there's not. We're just checking to see if the size of our array list is equal to 0. And this method size just ultimately tells us how many items are currently found in the array list. So right now there's 4 things in this array list, and 4 is not equal to 0. So we get to skip the body of our if statement and then continue running the program after that final curly brace. Okay? So in this case, we are creating a variable. More specifically, we are creating a variable named sum, and it's being initialized to a new integer. More specifically, that integer is 0. So let's write that down so we don't forget. Sum is 0. We continue on, and we see a for loop. Now I know it's really easy to look at a for loop and be like, no variables here. But don't forget, our for loop is a little more concise than our while loop. In that first slot, a variable is being declared and initialized. So in this case, we got to write it down. It's another name. So we have I, and it's storing the value 0. So let's write that down. Here's I, and it's storing 0. Then we have our Boolean expression is I less than the current size of our array list. Well, what's the size? It's 1, 2, 3, 4. So our size is 4 items and I is 0. Well, 0 is indeed less than 4. So we get to execute the body of our for loop. And here you can see we're updating the value of sum. Sum is going to be itself, whatever it is, in this case 0. And we're going to add the item found at this index. Remember, index is just how we talk about the position of an item within an array or an array list. In this case, we're talking about the item found at index I. What's I? Well, it's 0. So what item is found at index 0 of our array list? So index 0, remember, is the first spot. So we're going to get 0, which means that we are going to add 0 to 0. So the value doesn't itself change to a different number. It just stays 0. But I still want you to mark that change. We have 0 here. And then, don't forget, with our for loop, the last thing we do is this last section seen inside of the parentheses, which is our update statement. In this case, we have shorthand for adding 1 to the current value of I. So we cross that out, and we put 1. We jump back up to the top. We ask ourselves, is I less than the current size of our array list? Well, 1 is less than 4. Remember, size tells us how many items are in an array list. So we get to execute the body, where we add the value found at index I, so in this case 1, to the current value of sum. So we're going to grab the number 1 and add it to our current value of sum. So 0 plus 1. And then we update the value of I and jump back up to the top of our for loop. So we ask ourselves, is I less than the size of the array list? Well, 2 is less than 4. Then we run the body of our for loop again. In this case, we're going to get the item found at the index I, which is 2, and that's the number 2. And we're going to add that to the current value of sum. So 2 plus 1 is 3. And then we update the value of I. And jump back up to the top of our for loop, where we ask, is I less than the size of the array list? Well, 3 is still less than 4, so we execute the body of our for loop, get the item found at index I, which is 3, and that happens to be our last item. We add that to the current value of sum, which is 6. And then we update the value of I, making it 4. Now is 4 less than or equal to the size of, less than our array list size? Well, 4 is not less than the size of our array list. The size is 4, so those are equal, which means we can't run the body of our for loop. We look for that last curly brace, and we see if there are any lines of code found after it that need to be executed. In this case, we're returning sum. So write that down. It may help to also, cross out our statement or call statement and write the current value of sum, which is 6. So in this case, we're going to print out the number 6. And that is the end of this memory table. I know, because I'm going to cross it out. So that's how you use memory tables. Let me know if you have any questions.